All right, welcome, Michelle. Looks like we got some people coming in the room. We've got the ABA Day Planning Committee Chair, Bill Bay, with us. I guess we'll give it just maybe 30 seconds for people to filter in. We just opened the room. Wow, it's a popular room. Tracy Giles, hello, from Virginia, our state captain. Wow, a lot of people joining us. Appreciate it. Well, welcome, everybody. Again, we'll give it maybe another 10 seconds or so for people to filter in. All right, looks like they're still strolling in, but we'll get started. We have a limited amount of time before the afternoon, the rest of the afternoon programming begins. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm David Epstein. I'm Legislative Counsel with the American Bar Association's Governmental Affairs Office here in D.C. And of course, as I talk, there's a helicopter flying by, but hopefully you can hear me all right. So without further ado, what I thought I'd do is very quickly just kind of explain what we're going to do here for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. And that is just to go over our Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, one of our star entities at the American Bar Association, led by Vivian Welgo and Rebecca Henry. So what I thought we would do is kind of turn it over to them to kick it off and explain a little bit about what the commission does, their activities, and of course, if they want to touch on the recently reauthorized Violence Against Women Act, we would love to hear that, and a hooray for that. We were all super excited to see that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rebecca and Vivian. Thank you.
Thanks, David. It's great to partner with you on this and in all of the other activities in which we get to partner with you and with governmental affairs. I'm Vivian Welgo, Chief Counsel for the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. We are one of many entities of the American Bar Association. We are the same age as the Violence Against Women Act, and we provide training, technical assistance, support, and resources to lawyers nationally and internationally who are representing or combating gender-based violence, representing survivors of gender-based violence. And that looks like publications, it looks like consultations, it looks like referrals to experts. It looks like ongoing work with organizations to expand pro bono panel programs, for example. So the other piece that we work on, and that is really Rebecca's area of expertise, is the development of policy resolutions for the House of Delegates. And some of the recent work that she's been doing is on this reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. So I will let her brief all of you on some of, I would say, the wins, the compromises, and some of the disappointments in this recent reauthorization, which there are some. So Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you, and then we can take some questions in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Vivian, and thanks, David. This is a really cool platform. I just have to say it's great how you can see everyone who's in the room and be able to interact. So thanks for arranging this. Excuse me. As many of you probably know, the Violence Against Women Act was in need of reauthorization. It was due for reauthorization in 2018. And lots of advocates and some lawmakers, looked at commencing that process, put in a lot of hard work in 2018 and onward, aiming towards reauthorization, but there just wasn't a political landscape to support it. And so it took us until this past March, like a month ago, actually almost exactly a month ago, that the president signed the comprehensive appropriations bill, the omnibus appropriations bill, and VAWA was sort of slipped into that at the last minute by consent of both parties. And so we were thrilled to have that finally reauthorized. It was a product that had been in drafting form for, at that point, years, with lots of input from different members of Congress, all sorts of advocacy organizations, folks who are representing survivors, folks who are working with survivors directly. And so in general, it's an amazing bill. It's an amazing accomplishment. We're thrilled with everything that got into the bill. Lots of good improvements and lots of increases in authorized funding levels, which was really critically important. We know inflation doesn't always get captured in appropriations, and so that'll be a huge help to folks in the field to be able to see more dollars into their programs in the coming years. As with any piece of legislation, it's a process of negotiation and compromise, and so there were some hard compromises from the point of view of advocates around having to let go of some things we'd hoped to see in firearms prevention and oversight, and some hoped for gains in the housing arena in federally subsidized housing that we weren't able to make happen. And of course, immigration reform was left entirely out of VAWA, which is it's the first time that's been the case since VAWA was initially passed in 1994. It's always had something to say about how to respond to and support immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And this year, we weren't able to do that because of the political environment. So that's a huge disappointment. But we'll continue to look for other vehicles and other mechanisms to continue to bring those needs to Congress and hope for appropriate response around those issues. So I will pause to see. This is supposed to be more interactive, right? Not just me talking. So I'd love to see if anyone has any comments or questions. Are there any raised hands, or do you, Vivian, want to talk about some more specific targeted
I think
pieces?
One of the questions we get a lot about is what is the firearms piece that was left out, because it's one that I think some folks might resonate with some folks from headlines.
Sure. What we had hoped for, what we had worked on, was a proposal to close the so-called boyfriend loophole and the stalking loophole. Current law, actually dating back to, I think, 98. It wasn't in the very first VAWA, but it was in an amended version of VAWA that came a couple of years later under the Lautenberg Amendment, prohibits possession of firearms by people who are convicted of a misdemeanor or felony domestic violence crime, or who have a certain qualifying civil protection order issued against them for domestic violence. And so that piece has been in there, as I said, for more than 20 years. What it misses is victims of dating violence, so people who are not married to or have a child in common with the person who is abusing them, and people who are survivors of stalking. So it's slightly different, though hugely overlapping dynamic. So those folks are currently under federal law. Those perpetrators are not prohibited from possessing firearms, which is just seen as a huge and obvious loophole from the perspective of advocates, because whether or not someone has a marriage certificate shouldn't necessarily determine whether or not they're protected from gun violence. So there was hope that we would have been able to close those loopholes by just adding dating partner and stalking to the definitions of those prohibitors, but that was too much for some members of Congress to tolerate. And so if we wanted to move forward with a whole VAWA and achieve all the accomplishments we had in other areas, we very sadly had to let that piece go. Which is not to say we won't still work towards it, but just not as a piece of VAWA this time.
So for service providers who work with survivors, for lawyers who work with survivors, they've been talking about some wins for tribal survivors, for LGBT survivors, some wins in terms of allocated funding for finally research and evaluation of restorative justice programs. Can you brief folks who are here in our room about what some of those wins look like, just while we wait for some questions to come in? And please feel free to type your question into the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Please ask questions. It's more fun for everyone that way. Some of the really big victories, huge, generational victory for tribal survivors is the, first of all, establishment of permanent jurisdiction, recognition of tribes' inherent authority to adjudicate domestic violence crimes and sexual assault and stalking child abuse and abuse of law enforcement crimes that occur in Indian country. And so that wasn't the case prior to 2013. In 2013, a pilot program was authorized to allow some tribes to try to build out that capacity. And it was a raging success. Absolutely no complaints were filed, no habeas petitions were filed. I mean, it sort of everything went flawlessly with the pilot project. And so in this reauthorization, it was moved into permanent status. It's no longer a pilot. Any tribe who meets the prerequisites for being able to provide due process for defendants and all of the sort of infrastructure requirements, any tribe who can meet those can exercise special jurisdiction over these crimes that are related to gender-based violence in Indian country. And so that's just a huge transformation of law for our tribal friends. Can't be understated.
And I just want to jump in and say that our big partner at the Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence in all tribal issues, our big partner is the Civil Rights and Social Justice section. Yes. I think I just saw the chair-elect join us. So thank you to CRSJ for always partnering with us on all of the issues that have to do with tribal survivors. We could not do it without them leveraging their huge platform in their section. Thank you.
Absolutely critical. Some of the other, you mentioned restorative justice. There is some money set aside for pilot programs in considering a restorative justice approach to gender-based violence. It's essentially there's a definition was written so that we could sort of all be on the same page, understanding what we mean when we say restorative justice in the context of gender-based violence. And a pilot program was established with very, I would say, very conservative and restrictive safety guides, sort of bumpers for this pilot project to make sure that we do no harm, but to be able to explore the idea of using a restorative justice framework to respond to gender-based violence. And that's something that survivors have been requesting for decades. I mean, since before VAWA was even authorized in the 90s, there were survivors who were saying, let's not go with this very heavy-handed criminal, tough on crime approach. We'd much rather do a more restorative community-based practice. And those voices were sort of silenced for a long time. And so now we've gotten to a point where we're able to at least start trying it out and experimenting a little bit in under safe conditions in this pilot to see how that might work out and if it better serves the needs of certain populations of survivors. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and adoption of restorative justice practices have been, I think, weaved into criminal legal reforms across the country, always excluding gender-based violence. But like you said, it's something that the practitioners, the lawyers who represent these survivors have been wanting to examine and explore in a safe way. And so that's why research and evaluation of these programs is so important. So we're really happy to see that happening.
Yep, looks like we only have a couple minutes left. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but as we wrap up here, I did want to raise an issue that you talked about earlier in terms of the real-world consequences of this VAWA reauthorization, because many of the people in the room joining us will be advocating for more funding for these programs. I was wondering if just maybe in the next 30 seconds or so, excuse me, you could talk about what exactly these programs do for survivors and where does the survivor go and to get help and just how essential these things are for survivors.
Sure, absolutely. VAWA sort of has two parts to it. There's the federal law piece where there's immigration law and prison reform and federal housing and all of those like positive law. And then there's the grant funding programs. There are 22 different funding streams authorized under VAWA, and those are open for local communities and states to apply for across the country.